Okay, I'm Gene Veith. I know quite a few of you. I am retired, longtime English professor. Appreciate the chance to get back into, get my hands dirty with literature again. So glad to have you as part of that. We have 3 sessions. What we're going to do today, I'm going to talk about kind of some of the ways literature can convey truth, different aspects of meaning in the work of literature, and how we can get at that. Then the next day, the next session, we're going to look at some stories and try to apply it. And I'll ask your help with that. I thought I would find some stories that everybody knows already, so we don't have to worry about preliminaries. The stories we're going to look at are some fairy tales. Actually, a lot of young people, a lot of children are growing up without knowing the fairy tales, and that's part of the cultural problems, I think, in transmitting the wisdom from one generation to the next. But anyway, we'll have some fun with that. And then the next time, I'm going to show you, we're going to work with a real serious classic piece of literature by a great, great writer that I would bet almost anything, none of you have read this. It's one of the undeservedly forgotten works of literature by a great writer. And it's on basically the theme of this conference. As we delve into the meaning, it's about, in a way, classical education versus modern kinds of education, classical way of thinking versus modern ways of thinking, and it's incredible in the way it predicts things we're going through right now, even though it was written in the early 1700s. So anyway, we'll look forward to that. So, teaching truth through literature. By the way, I was one of the truly late adopters of PowerPoint. I resisted it just as long as I could and scorned it and never used it. Now just, I guess about since I've retired and have more time on my hands, I've had to do a PowerPoint with some presentations I did, and I really got into it, finding the right images, finding the right pictures. So I kind of indulged myself with this. So yeah, teaching truth through literature. Okay, and here's the real problem with this topic. A big part of literature is fiction. And fiction, by definition, means a story that isn't true. So, maybe I should just fold this up and we can just go on. Maybe that's the answer. To some Christian, that has been the answer. During the 17th century especially, there were a number of Puritan Christians who rejected the use of literature of any kind, mainly because it's about things that aren't true. Now, the definitive answer to that came from a man named Sir Philip Sidney. Now, Sir Philip Sidney was the model kind of student that we're trying to turn out in classical education. You've heard of the Renaissance man. And there were also Renaissance women, by the way. People who, armed with a classical education, it seemed like they could do everything and do it well. Sidney, biggest example of that, I guess, is Leonardo da Vinci, who was a scientist, an artist, a poet, an engineer, everything. Because he had developed his mind through the new classical learning that nothing, it seemed like, was outside of his ability. Sir Philip Sidney was kind of like that. He was a poet, great accomplishment. He wrote some very great early sonnets, great love poetry. You probably know one of the lines, fool, look in your heart and write. That was Sidney. He wrote a fantasy romance with his sister, the Countess of Pembroke. It's really very, very good. But he was also a statesman. He was involved with the political scene of the time under Queen Elizabeth. He was a great advocate for the Reformation, which had happened and was reaching England, not too long ago. And some of the versions of it that reached England were kind of problematic in many ways. But he was a big defender of the Bible, the grace of God, grace alone, and so on. He was also a soldier, and he fought in a number of important battles, and was really a war hero. And he died in battle, I think he was just in his 20s. Incredible potential, died very young. But one of the things we're going to look at, and what has really been lasting, is a work he wrote in 1595 called An Apology for Poetry. Sometimes you'll see it kind of rendered as a defense of poetry. Now, poetry, remember, was at that time was sort of a shorthand term for all imaginative literature, because all imaginative literature was written in poetry. Prose was used for history and for nonfiction. So the early histories were written in prose. The great stories, the Iliad, the Odyssey, they were written in poetry. The plays, like of Shakespeare, one of his contemporaries, was written, the plays were written in poetry. And so whether it's drama or stories or lyrical poetry, expression of emotions and so on, they were all written in verse. Again, prose was reserved for factual material. By the way, why is that important in our defense of the Bible, especially the Gospels? Some people say, oh, well, that's a nice, like a novel, that's a nice story, these stories about Jesus, but that doesn't mean he actually lived or that this stuff actually happened. C.S. Lewis gave the best answer. And Lewis, of course, was a literary historian. And he made the point that the kind of writing, the idea of writing a story that isn't true, writing fiction with prose, using the style of the Gospels, the Gospel writers would have to be anticipating forms of literature that weren't even invented until the middle of the 18th century, which would have been miraculous in itself. The Gospels are written in prose. That means they were written as history. They actually happened. The Bible does contain poetry, lyric poetry, the Psalms, some of the prophetic books are written in the most beautiful, most powerful forms of Hebraic poetry. But those aren't stories. Those are we would classify them as a kind of lyric poetry, which there's never a doubt that a lyric poem is expressing what the poet is saying or feeling or experiencing. So anyway, Sir Philip Sidney was taking on a Puritan writer who had written a book condemning imaginative literature. He says, these are lies. Christianity is all about truth. it's fine to read history or philosophy. These things deal with true things, nonfiction. But don't waste your time reading, the King Arthur sagas or fairy tales or fantasies or plays or anything else like that. So Sir Philip Sidney wrote this great defense that still, I think, deals with that question about as well as anything I've seen. First of all, is fiction a lie? That was the main accusation. And Sidney said, now for the poet, or the fiction writer, the imaginative writer, now for the poet, he nothing affirmeth, and therefore never lieth. He said an imaginative writer is the one kind of thing where you won't find a lie, because he's not affirming what he's saying to be factual. Then go on. It says to lie is to affirm that to be true, which is false. So is the other artist, and especially the historian, affirming many things can, in the cloudy knowledge of mankind, hardly escape from many lies. Okay, and the historian claims everything he's writing is true. Well, then it turns out that it's not. He misses something. You'll find all kinds of lies among historians because they're trying to affirm truth and they keep missing it. You'll find all kinds of lies among philosophers because they're uttering these truths, but then the next philosopher comes around and totally refutes everything they've said. Oh, no offense, Dr. Manouche. Sorry. Present company accepted. Dr. Manouche is a philosopher at Concordia, my old friend and colleague. And sorry, Professor Mobley, for saying what they did about historians. She's a historian. It's not me, it's Sir Philip Sidney. Blame him. Okay. He says, well, but the poet, here's the point. The poet, as I said before, never affirmeth. The poet never maketh any circles about your imagination to conjure you to believe for true what he writeth. He says when you go to a play and it's set before the walls of Rome, you don't think that the paper background of the setting is actually the walls of Rome. Nobody thinks that. Or that the three extras wearing their funny fake helmets and carrying fake spears, you don't think they're really the army of Rome from back then that conquered much of the known world. No, in fact, fiction reminds you that it's fiction. We're going to see that in some of the things we're going to look at. And so the poet isn't saying, or again, a fairy tale begins once upon a time, might have talking animals. And, the whole point, even a child knows, Sidney says, that these are not, that we're talking about an imaginative creation, not an attempt to render factual events. Okay. So he goes on. He says, if then a man can arrive at that child's age to know that the poet's persons and doings are but pictures of what should be and not stories what have been, they will never give the lie to things not affirmatively but allegorically and figuratively written. Okay, now notice, he's getting into some meaning. He says works of imagination are not just affirming that this actually happened, but they're working allegorically symbolically and figuratively. Okay, that a poet, the imaginative author, is working in the mode of the imagination, not reason, not emotion, not these other things, which has a relationship to truth in the outside world, but it works allegorically and figuratively. Okay, we'll get into that some more. And therefore, as in history looking for truth, they may go away full fraught with falsehood. So in poesy, looking but for fiction, they shall use the narration but as an imaginative ground, an imaginative ground plot of a profitable invention. Okay, again, a historian is looking for truth, but they just go away with falsehood. By the same token, somebody reading fiction, just looking for, a fun story, may come away with truth. Again, an imaginative ground plot. Literature addresses primarily the imagination. No, it can address the reason as you try to figure it out and other faculties. Now, the imagination is simply our ability to picture things in our mind. It's really all it is. If I say tree, you can picture a tree. It's an amazing power that God has given us, isn't it? You can imagine things like, what you did yesterday. The memory uses the imagination. You might be able to remember and bring back into your mind, into your imagination, what you got for Christmas when you were 10 years old and you got that BB gun or that bicycle and how it felt. You still have that and you can bring it back with your mind, with your imagination. And of course you can imagine things that haven't happened. This is not just literary. I mean, if you're planning something, people who planned this conference had to imagine it. Okay, what would happen if this happened? What do we need to do? What are people going to want? What if they get dizzy from altitude sickness? So again, that they've taken care of that. But that faculty of the imagination is a very important quality, very important power that's really amazing. One of the important reasons to study literature and why it's so important in a classical curriculum is the training of the imagination. It isn't just a matter of knowledge. It isn't just a matter of being able to reason well. Those are all important. We do that. But the power to imagine well. We sin. We can sin in our imaginations. We have sinful fantasies. But good works also require imagination. We're told to rejoice with those, weep with those who weep, and rejoice with those who rejoice. That's St. Paul is advocating empathy, and that's an imaginative. You imagine what someone else is going through, being able to share that to some extent. That's imagination. But we've sort of neglected this, I think, or dismissed it, or just put it off as entertainment, or just diversion, or just something to fill idle moments. The imagination needs training and discipline and use and pushing to imagine, to become a better and better imaginer. Scientists have to imagine the models they use. Engineers have to imagine something in order to invent something or figure out how it will work. So this is a power, and this is what literature addresses. But Sidney is focusing on really the moral use of the imagination and the moral use of literature. he says it's a profitable invention. The writer, the author is inventing something, creating something new. Not just imitating what's already there, is imitating things, human nature and other things in the story, but it's a creation in a sense, and it's profitable. Sidney says the purpose of literature is to teach and delight. He says poesy, therefore, is an art of imitation. Again, the writer is imitating the outside world, imitating truth. The story is representing, counterfeiting, or figuring forth. To speak metaphorically, a speaking picture. I love that description of a poem. It is like a picture, a painting, but it uses words instead of color and daubs of paint. It uses language. So it's an artistic creation using words with this end, to teach and delight. We're going to get into the ways that literature, even though it's not in the business of affirming things, nevertheless can teach and can teach truth. But the difference, it also needs to delight. To delight. And that's what he says about this. Its subject is what may be or should be, not what is. That's what the historian is all about. But what may be, possibility, or even what should be. He'll argue that stories can have a lot more moral clarity than we often find just in the world or in real life narrations. Because you can isolate these things and present them and think about them in a clear way. Okay, philosophy, he says, is too abstract. History, if it's good, accurate history, includes the bad. And it says you can't learn from history. What you might learn from history are bad things. In history, the bad guys often win. So I say, I'll be bad like that. And so history, that's a different order. And again, he's not really denigrating philosophy. But the beauty of literature is that, first of all, it's down to earth. So if a writer is writing about big ideas, you can keep them up in the abstract realm, and you need to do that at some point. That's what philosophers do. But the story will bring that idea down and present it in terms of actual people, actual events, real situations, which makes it easier to understand those big, complicated ideas that the philosophers are rightly exploring. Literature is concrete. And again, literature, at the same time, history may not really include the ideas. There are all kinds of lessons you can draw from history. Literature is concrete, like history is, but it has a place for those, ideal philosophical points too. But here's the point about delighting. Sidney thought that a story should be enjoyable. It should be fun. It should be entertaining. Those aren't necessarily bad things in literature. Sometimes we academics kind of take all the pleasure out of it. I realize that and plead guilty. But a good story teaches, but it doesn't just teach. It also delights. And, in fact, it teaches by delighting. It teaches by delighting. Sidney said delight can move a person. Okay. In other words, it's one thing to know that something is good and something is bad. Literature, by training our imagination, can help us to be disgusted by what's bad, to not want to be like that villain. We don't like him. We don't want to be like him. But, maybe more important, to take the virtues and make us want to be that way. You read the hero defeats the villain. We want to be like the hero. Okay? And he says delight in literature can move us to better behavior. He said, delight can move men to take that goodness in hand, which without delight they would fly as from a stranger. Giving your life for somebody, dying for somebody else. I just read a novel where this happens. It's a war story. Of course, for Christian, that speaks to us of Christ. And greater love has no man than this, so the man give up his life for his friends. But in this novel, people are sacrificing themselves for their friend. And normally, a person might think, oh, I wouldn't do that. Why should I give up myself for somebody else? But in a work of literature, you see how noble that is. You see how impressive that is. It's presented in such an attractive way that you say, yeah, you see what's good about goodness and what's bad about badness. And he says delight can move the reader to virtue. Okay. He says, where the philosophers, as they scorn to delight, so must they be content little to move. Okay, sorry, Angus. Feel bad about that. But did you see his point? I mean, it's very easy to give the reasons why you should do this and that and that and that and that in very complicated language and prove it rationally. But if somebody hears that, does that mean they want to do that? Maybe not. Actually, I think some of the best philosophers, such as Plato, we heard about him. Sidney says this. Plato was one of those who scorned literature because it's not telling the truth. And he said that's ironic because Plato was the most poetic of the philosophers. He's always telling these great stories. His language is beautiful, and it pulls you into it in a way that Aristotle or others, it just doesn't. But he also says that Plato was criticizing the pagan poets for abuse of literature, for using poetry to tell immoral stories about the mythological gods who don't really exist. And he was right to do that. And of course, with this power of literature, it is possible to make readers delight in what is bad. And actually, that's what we're facing today in contemporary literature, and a lot of contemporary young adult literature and children's literature. And this is why it's so important. It presents people doing bad things in a sympathetic way that can make the reader want to follow them. Okay, Sidney is talking about the other use for virtue. Anyway, he says, the poet doth not only show the way, but give us so sweet a prospect into the way as will entice any man to enter into it. Again, he not only shows how, the right way, but makes a person want to go in that way. So to sort of sum up Sidney for our question now, in fiction, the story isn't true, but the meaning can be true. Okay, the events of the narration didn't actually happen, but the meaning that is conveyed, it can be true. It can be false too. But you have to look at it in terms of the meaning and not just the literal events that it's portraying. So I want us to think about the meaning of a story and the different aspects of the story and different ways of looking for and digging out that meaning and those meanings, because there are different types of meaning that you can look at in a work of literature. Okay, here's a diagram of sort of the literary relationships. You have, the author has written a text, whether it's a novel or a poem or a play. Again, this works with other kinds of communication also. The author making a statement, giving a speech, or telling you something, or writing something. And then you have the reader who receives the text, and so you have this interrelationship between the author of the text and the reader. Now the truth is outside the author, outside the text, outside the reader. That's another story, as we've been learning about. The meaning of the text is kind of emerges out of this interrelationship. The author is expressing in the text has a meaning that he's trying to convey. The reader, if it's the meaning is clear, picks up that meaning from the text. The reader might add other kinds of meaning. And then the meaning, may be a true meaning. It might be a false meaning. It might be a wrong, misleading message. But this is kind of the relationship. So I want to just briefly, before we get into actual stories, just go through kind of some things to watch for in these different realms. Okay, well, of course, it starts with the author. Okay, very often the author has a certain intention. He's trying to convey something. He has the sense that he wants to convey, war is hell. So he writes a story that tries to get across that insight that he had. Or he may have an intention to spread the gospel, or he may have the intention to just make some money by telling a story that he thinks will sell. Again, an author can have many different intentions. There are unintentional disclosures when you study an author and you read a work. Sometimes the author expresses maybe more than was intended. For example, you can tell from this story that the author is really an obnoxious human being. Okay. Yeah, that wasn't the intention, but that's still something that you can see from the author. One of the great examples of the author in Chaucer's Pardoner's Tale, in the Canterbury Tales, as you may know, Chaucer has all these different characters going on this pilgrimage to Canterbury, and along the way they each tell stories to pass along the time. And you've got people from all walks of life and all different kinds of personalities, and the story reflects the person. And most of them are hilarious. Some are serious. You have the whole range of medieval literature in that story. But anyway, he tells about the pardoner. The pardoner is a seller of indulgences. Again, for us Lutherans, that's very interesting because Luther posted his theses against indulgences in 1517. Chaucer was writing in the 1300. And also when you read other literature of the time, Dante also criticizes the sale of indulgences and all the corruption in the church that represents and the distortions of Christianity. Again, Luther's insights were not just with him. So anyway, Chaucer presents this pardoner, the seller of indulgences. He also has all these fake relics that he gets people to worship for a price. He says, yeah, I'll take an old pillow. And he tells the people what he does. He gives all of his sales techniques. He says, yeah, I'll take an old pillowcase and say, this is the veil of the Virgin Mary. So they'll pay me all kinds of money to touch it. And it's great. I do really well. I make a lot of money at this. Anyway, so you see him kind of in a rare moment of honesty telling all his tricks. But then he tells the story. And it's actually a really good moral story on the theme that the love of money is the root of all evil. And it's just a great moral story against greed. Now, the irony is the guy that's telling the story, everything he's saying reflects back at him, but he doesn't seem to catch on. Somehow bad greed is. Well, he's the greediest guy in the whole part. And anyway, it's very hilarious. And the conclusion is that even an immoral man can tell a moral story. You have other examples of that in literature. So it's not just the intention, because sometimes the story tells more than the person really intends it to. You can look at connections in the story to the author's biography, and it's very interesting to research that, how this story reflects and grows out of the life of the author. You can look at the historical context. You know, that this story about war was, say, written in the time of World War I. And that he's commenting on a lot of the things that were happening at that time. Again, that can bring out, truths that are in that story. or the cultural context. We'll see some examples of that later. That the story is reflecting things in the culture that were very big at that time, and maybe they're not such issues now, but when you're aware of the cultural context of the story, again, you see more meaning and more truths. The author's worldview. Christians do quite a bit with the worldview of a work of art or a work of literature. The assumptions about nature, about human beings. Are human beings good or bad, or a mixture? Is there a God? Is there life after death? Is life meaningless or meaningful? And especially if you're studying these big issues, literature is a good way to do that. And a lot of Christian schools do a lot with studying the worldview of a work. And that's not just the philosophy or the beliefs, it's a view, it's the imagination. In other words, if you think the world is meaningless, then it's going to be very dark. And there's going to be a lot of absurdities and tragic things that happen to no purpose in the work. And that grows out of the worldview of the author. Okay, I'm going to hurry through some of this. Now, there's some things to consider of the reader. A lot of people say, well, different readers find different meanings in the story. Well, a lot of those meanings, And then they say that so the meaning of the story really is in the reader, not in the author or in the work or in the world or anywhere else. And I think what you see is there are different applications. A reader will read something and then apply that to her own personal life. And that may be, and another reader might apply it in a different way. But these are applications. You can read the war story that shows its theme is war is hell, and you can apply it and say, I'm going to be a pacifist. Someone else might apply it to applaud the bravery of our veterans who've gone through that for us. And again, some may completely reject any good from it. Others may see that even as horrible as that is, there's a reason to honor the people that went through this. And so those aren't really different meanings, different readings. It's taking the story and applying it in different ways. One thing to watch for is the effect of a work of literature. A lot of Christians, I think, forget this when they evaluate literature. I've heard somebody object to the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe because it has a witch in it. And so it could become an entry point for occult powers and all of that. Well, is that the effect of reading Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, that you want to be a witch and get involved with the occult? No. What? Or a book that contains adultery. Now, there are some works about adultery that do make you want to commit adultery. By the way, we worry about effect on children. I'm maybe more worried about the effect on adults, of the things that we read, things we take into ourselves, because we can do a lot more harm with them. I mean, there are romance novels that glamorize adultery, right, and sexual sin, and make you want to run away from your family, right? There are other works about adultery. I'm thinking of the King Arthur saga, which really is about, it's about a lot of things, but the key plot is the adultery between Lancelot and Guinevere, which ends up destroying this beautiful kingdom that Arthur has set up. All of Camelot is destroyed. The Fellowship of the Knights turns into civil war. At the end of it, everybody's killed. Well, except Lancelot and Guinevere. If you read Mallory's Le Morte d'Arthur, the last scene, Arthur, all the knights, everything, they're all dead. The kingdom is just burning rubble. And Lancelot and Guinevere see each other. You might think, oh, now they can live happily ever after. They have no more obstacles to their love. You know, that would be how a modern work would probably handle it. But in Mallory, they see the consequences of their unlawful relationship. And Lancelot's response is to join a monastery. Guinevere becomes a nun. They're filled with repentance that drives them to the religious life. But anyway, you read King Arthur, yeah, it's about adultery. But the effect of it is to make the reader not want to commit adultery. Whereas another work might make you want to. And so look at the effect. It isn't just, does this have sex in it, or does it have violence in it? Yeah, there's some works of literature that make you want to commit violence, that moves you to delight in just killing somebody, letting all your anger and your hateful emotions out. And again, it cultivates that. But the greatest literature may be very violent, but it can lead you to compassion by making you sensitive to the victims of the violence. It can make you look at your own tendencies towards violence and hatred and all these other things and make you aware of them and make you want to repent of those, make you want to be cleansed of those. So the effect is very important, and it's complicated. It's not just a matter of the content, it's a matter of how the writer presents it and what it does to a reader. Again, some literature can make us less sensitive to other people, some can make us more sensitive. And again, as teachers and as parents and as readers ourselves, we need to show good judgment and good taste and good discernment and find what is good and what will be good for us, rather than just eating the garbage and junk food that's out there that can poison our imagination. Okay, interpretation. It has been said that the writer expresses an intention, but it's up to the reader to interpret it. There are works that do demand interpretation, that you have to figure it out. You have to work at it in order to get it's not just its meaning, but its value. Okay, other works are pretty clear. Sometimes you just need help with them. The one I'm going to give you in 2 days, you need a little bit of help with it. And that's why you need teachers and English professors and critics. But it's clear, it's lucid, it's very, it's not a puzzle to solve, but there are some things you need to know in order to appreciate it. And then there's a personal response. The reader can read something and it reminds the reader of his childhood, or it reminds the reader of something that she experienced at one time in her life. And so there are legitimate personal responses that a work can bring. And that doesn't mean there are different meanings exactly, but we take it and receive it, and it does different things for us. Okay, but then there's the text itself. Okay, the text, even apart from the author or the reader, it will have built into it very often certain things. Very often it will have some kind of themes, some kind of ideas that it's exploring. The theme is one of the elements of a fiction. You have plot, character, setting, and theme. The theme is kind of the point of the story. What makes sense of it all, what brings it all together. Again, we'll look at this later. But you want to find the themes that are sort of embedded in the story. Reference. A story will often refer to things outside itself. The World War I story might refer to a battle that actually happened, or to the assassination of the Archduke that started it all. Or a story may refer to the Bible, to biblical texts, to biblical stories. It may allude to other things outside of itself. And to really understand a work, you want to follow those up, because the Bible reference it's alluding to may turn out to be the key to the whole thing. Motifs. Notice things that are repeated in a story or in a poem or a drama. I'll give you some good examples of this later, but there's certain things that keep being repeated. Okay, those are probably especially important for the meaning of the story. Okay, that's probably a good clue to the author's intention. Why did the author repeat all of these references to light and darkness, or to Christmas, or to food, or whatever it is? And that's a good way to sort of find the meaning that's in the text. I'll give you good examples of that later. Symbolism. Sidney said, imaginative literature often works by symbols. No, need to close this off. I'll talk about the different kinds of symbols and how to interpret a symbol a little bit later because we're over time. Every plot has a conflict. There can't be a story where everybody just lives happily ever after. There's always a conflict. And if you can identify the conflict in the story, you can usually see what the issues are that story is dealing with. And the text, in ways, a subcreation. J.R.R. Tolkien talks about that. God is the real creator, but what he creates actually exists. The human being can create something, only it doesn't exist. We're far from God. And yet, the same patterns of consistencies, internal laws, and other things that we have in the real world also need to be at work in the imaginative world. Okay, next time we will show how this all works, and we will apply it to some fairy tales, and we'll see what they mean and what truth they too can disclose. All right, thank you.